Hello and welcome to the History Crew channel. In this video, we will explore the topic of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The increasing tension between the United States of America and USSR during the Cold War stretched to all parts of the world, as both countries were vigorously expanding their spheres of influence, whilst trying to contain their adversary at the same time. The crisis, which came closer than any other to a war between the superpowers, happened in Latin America, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both superpowers used the tactic of brinkmanship, by which each superpower would test and push their opponent to the edge, that is, to the point of declaring open warfare. Cuba is an island which lies just 160 kilometers off the coast of the United States. USA had a large naval base on the island, at Guantanamo Bay, so as to protect their economic and political interests in the area. American companies controlled much of the economic wealth of the country, for example, oil refineries, mines, cattle ranches, hotels and railways, whilst many Cubans lived in extreme poverty. In 1952, a dictator called Batista seized power, and he also had the support of the USA because Batista was anti-communist. But a group of revolutionaries, led by Fidel Castro, eventually overthrew the government of Batista in January 1959. From the start, the U.S. government was suspicious of the new Cuban government under Castro, especially after Castro implemented socialist reforms and nationalized the large industries such as the sugar industry. Many of these reforms affected the American investors. The USA became even more hostile when Castro started trade negotiations with the USSR. And thousands of Soviet technicians and advisors started arriving in Cuba. The US became convinced that the Castro regime was communist, and the Americans certainly did not want a communist country so close to the United States. There were many Cubans who did not support Castro and fled from the island and gone to live in the USA. With assistance from the CIA, an armed force of these exiles invaded Cuba. They landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba in April 1961, to overthrow Castro's government, but was a total failure, because Castro's forces were warned and lay in wait. The Bay of Pigs fiasco was deeply embarrassing to the USA, both because their involvement had been publicly exposed. After this, Castro announced that he was a communist and turned increasingly to the USSR for economic and diplomatic support. Tensions between USA and Cuba, as well as tensions between USA and USSR, increased substantially, especially after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. To prevent another invasion, Cuba agreed to allow USSR to install missile sites there. This was done secretly. The USSR thought this was appropriate given that NATO had missile bases in Turkey, which was on the doorstep. In October 1962, an American spy plane photographed these missile bases on the island, creating great alarm in Washington, because, once they were in place, every major US city would be in range of the missiles. In the first image, you can see an image of the American U-2 spy plane. It flies at a higher altitude than that of a commercial aircraft and is equipped with a powerful camera. As the aircraft flies over the area being monitored, the pilot will then take photos. You can see these photographs as well. The photographs were then sent to CIA analysts, who studied them very intensely, and once they recognized what they are looking for, they added labels onto the photo. President Kennedy then convened a group of advisors called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, who then studied the photographs and discussed what course of action they would take. He was advised that the USA should attack Cuba by bombing the missile bases or by sending an army to invade it, but he wanted to avoid a direct confrontation. Under increasing pressure, he ordered a naval quarantine to be set up to prevent the Russian ships with weapons from reaching Cuba. There was a debate on whether they should use the term blockade, but they decided that this was an aggressive term used in times of war. It would also portray USA as the aggressor. And so they settled on the use of the term quarantine. On the 22nd of October, Kennedy also made the bold move to address the American nation on television, in order to warn them of the clandestine activities taking place in Cuba. With the missile sites being built in Cuba, the Russians would have their weapons strategically placed on the doorstep of USA, and they would then have the capability of attacking any American city with ease. He also announced that if any Russian ships refused to be inspected or crossed the quarantine line, they would be sunk. He promised the American people that he would do whatever it takes to protect their freedom. This move by Kennedy was a master stroke. In addressing the American nation, he knew that the entire world would be watching, and he had successfully been able to portray Russia as the aggressor. Do not forget that the Russians were installing their missiles secretly, and now Kennedy had used that against them. Kennedy was implementing his tactic of brinkmanship with great success. He had made his move, and was now daring Khrushchev to make his. On the 22nd of October, a letter was also sent from JFK to Khrushchev, regarding the dangers of nuclear war to the victim as well as to the aggressor. It is important to take note that communication via letters was the only effective option. There was no direct telephonic communication, no video calling etc. at that time. This would only add to the tension, because the letter would have to be delivered and then you would have to wait for a response. In a critical situation such as this, a delay by just a second could result in war. For a tense few days the world awaited the Soviet reaction. On the 24th of October, Khrushchev sends an indignant letter to Kennedy, accusing him of threatening the Soviet Union. "You are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us," he writes. U.S. forces were placed on full alert and the world waited to see whether there would be a clash at sea which would lead to a nuclear war. The American Navy would stop any ship approaching Cuba and order them to be searched for weapons. Only ships with non-threatening cargo would be allowed to cross the quarantine line. For 13 days, the world's news was focused on the crisis. October the 25th and 26th marked the height of the crisis. American surveillance detected Russian ships, escorted by Russian submarines, approaching the quarantine line. This was now Khrushchev's attempt at using the tactic of brinkmanship. He had ordered his ships to continue to Cuba, in an attempt to force Kennedy to back down. The question then would be, to see if Kennedy would order his armed forces to attack. On the 25th of October, the American surveillance takes note that some of the Russian ships slowed down and turned back, but others still continued towards the quarantine line. American warships followed closely, in the event of being ordered to attack. Khrushchev was calling Kennedy's bluff. On the 26th of October, Castro sends a letter to Khrushchev, encouraging him to launch a nuclear strike on USA. Khrushchev ignores this letter, but sends another letter to Kennedy in which he appeals to the US president to work with him to de-escalate the conflict and ensure that they didn't doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war. The Americans are a little surprised by Khrushchev's softer approach. On the 27th of October, an American spy plane is shot down over Cuba. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev now realize that the situation is spiraling out of control. On the same day, Khrushchev sends another letter to Kennedy, in which he demands that the United States withdraw missiles from Turkey as part of the deal. JFK responds by offering to promise not to attack Cuba after the Russians withdraw. That evening, JFK's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, meets with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, and says that the United States already planned to remove its missiles from Turkey, but could not say so publicly, since other allies might feel let down. This meeting finally eases the tensions between USA and Russia. On the 28th of October, the deal was done and revealed at 9 a.m. on the radio. There would be no American invasion of Cuba, and withdrawal in due course of the ICBMs from Turkey, and the Soviet withdrawal of missiles from Cuba would take place. This crisis also made the superpowers realize just how close they came to plunging the world into a nuclear war. In order to facilitate more effective communication, a direct hotline was set up. Each president would now have direct communication with each other. The Cuban Missile Crisis also led to the superpowers agreeing to sign a nuclear test ban treaty, to halt the test of nuclear weapons. The missile sites were dismantled and with them went Khrushchev's prestige in the Soviet Union. It was not long, in October 1964, before Nikita Khrushchev, the Missile Man, as he was popularly known in the Soviet Union, was deposed. He spent the rest of his life in modest surroundings in semi-disgrace. Kennedy emerged from this crisis as a hero and his popularity grew in USA. In the following year, Kennedy was tragically assassinated whilst driving through Dallas, Texas. The Cuban Missile Crisis had indeed brought the world the closest it's ever been to a hot war. Luckily, common sense and good leadership prevailed. Thank you for watching this video and please do not forget to subscribe to the History Crew channel.